Welcome to Footprints and Impacts, the podcast where we uncover how the environment shapes our health and well-being. Whether you're curious about how chemicals in your surroundings affect you, or you're looking for practical ways to live a healthier life, you're in the right place. Brought to you by the Environmental Health Association of Canada and the Environmental Health Association of Quebec, this podcast shines a light on multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS, the importance of healthy, least toxic product choices, and what it means for those navigating this disability, where over 1 million Canadians have a diagnosis of MCS. We're here to raise awareness, offer resources for accessibility, prevention, and build a healthier, inclusive community. Let's dive in and explore how our footprints leave a lasting impact on our health and our planet. Welcome to today's episode. I'm your host, Marco. And in this special episode, we're diving deep into the connection between human health and our ecosystem, focusing on the effects of environmental toxins and their impact on the body. We'll also be exploring multiple chemical sensitivity, MCS, a condition that's often misunderstood but recognized as a disability, characterized by heightened sensitivity to chemicals and toxins in everyday life. Joining us today is Dr. John Molot, an expert in environmental health and a leading advocate for MCS awareness. With his extensive background in medicine and environmental research, Dr. Molot will share his insights on the development of MCS, its symptoms, challenges faced by those living with the condition, and ways to better manage and support individuals with MCS. Let's jump into this important conversation on environmental health and MCS. Welcome, Dr. John Molot, and thank you for joining us on our podcast. To start off the discussion, I'd like to ask you to define the term environment for us. Maybe briefly explain what it is and what we mean by the term when we use it throughout this conversation.
Generally speaking, for any living organism, whether it's us or a cell, the environment involves everything surrounding us and the impact that has on us or how we sense it. So usually when people think of the environment, they think of abnormal things in there like pollution. But anything that is foreign to a living organism is something that has to be sensed and dealt with. And we as humans read the environment in a variety of ways. One way is by our bodies being able to recognize pollutants, things that shouldn't be in our environment, something that we've generated over the last couple of centuries as we learn how to make things and pollute the air and the water and our foods and so on with things that we add. But our environment also includes the psychosocial environment. So we humans have an ability to read a room when we enter it, to recognize whether somebody is our friend or is pointing a gun at us. We read the environment a variety of different ways, and it's all the different ways that we sense the environment biologically, interpret what it means to us, either biologically or psychologically or socially. All of these things are part of our environment.
I assume a lot of the time when we think of the term environment, we automatically think of the outdoor environment. And I think it would be valuable if you could talk a bit more about those indoor environments as well and tell us what role do both our indoor and outdoor environments play in shaping human health.
Everybody's aware of outdoor pollution in the environment, what it's done for climate change. It's obviously had a major impact on how things work on a global level, oceans warming, et cetera, et cetera. The World Health Organization tells us that the second most common cause of chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative diseases, neurodevelopmental diseases, respiratory diseases, kidney diseases, the most common cause environmentally is tobacco smoke, and second is air pollution. And so we have all of these studies that are looking at chronic exposures to outdoor air pollution and its impact on developing chronic disease. Multiple studies. There is no doubt that there's a problem. The caveat is that 90% of our time breathing outdoor air is while we're indoors. And so there's an impact from the indoor environment as well. For example, if you live in a really airtight house or work in an airtight building, a lot of the outdoor pollution is kind of filtered out by the building and its ventilation system. But the indoor air also has sources of pollution. And the most significant sources of pollution are chemical. The chemicals in the indoor environment where we spend the vast majority of our time are much higher than they are in the outdoor environment. So we are actually a little less polluted from outdoor air indoors, but we add on to that the indoor pollutants of chemicals.
Thank you. That's really good. I'd like you to talk a bit more about environmental toxins and what they are. Maybe explain to us where these toxins come from and how we get exposed to them, whether we're in our homes, at our workplace, or just spending time outdoors.
Our traditional understanding of toxicology, the study of toxins and poisons, is that everything has a dose that can be toxic. Even water can be toxic. If you drink 25 glasses of water in a row, you're going to end up in intensive care unit because you've diluted all these important things in your body. So everything is potentially toxic. So a toxin is actually something that is foreign to a living organism. We're basically obviously a complicated living organism of trillions of cells. But even on a cellular level, there is a mechanism where the cell is aware of things that are foreign to it, foreign to its environment, that are either touching it or actually being absorbed inside. And the cell has to deal with it. And so the cell has a system in place to break it down and throw it out, or just throw it out. Because if it doesn't do a good job doing that, it has potential for damage because it doesn't belong there. So everything that is foreign to a cell, foreign to us, that manages to touch us or get into us, has the potential to be toxic. And because it has the potential, because it's foreign, we refer to them as toxins. And we all have in our cells, more or less, depending on which cell, a system in place to break things down and get rid of it. And if we can get rid of at least to throw it out of cells, we can send it to the kidney to pee it out, or to the liver to break it down more and detoxify it and get rid of it. We all have a system in place to manage these exposures that are common. And this system developed way before we began to pollute the planet. It's been developed for cells that learned how to survive in hostile environments at the beginning of life. And those systems are still in place today.
Yeah, that's just amazing. Honestly, great information. So, the research shows that environmental toxins lead to the development of a number of conditions, including asthma, autoimmune disorders, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and also neurodegenerative diseases like dementia. So, I'm wondering if you could provide us with a simplified explanation on how these toxins contribute to the development of such conditions in the body.
When we take things into our body, or we take things get absorbed into cells, they have to be broken down and gotten rid of. And so that system, if it's perfect, will get rid of everything immediately without any damage. And those systems are working constantly. The systems have been studied extensively just with respect to aging. And obviously, we age. Obviously, we get old. We're more likely to get sick with various things. Some of our organs start to work less effectively, and eventually the whole system stops working and we die. That's a natural process. And but as the cells are alive, they're producing all kinds of byproducts of their metabolism that they have to get rid of and send to the kidneys to pee it out and the liver to break it down. And that's how we have evolved as humans into this complex multicellular animal. But those systems are in place and they're working constantly and they are less than perfect. So what happens is when there is a toxic molecule as a byproduct that needs to be broken down, we break it down as fast as we can. But because the system is less than perfect, those molecules have an ability to damage neighboring molecules. And if there's enough of that, the cell becomes dysfunctional or even dies. And it's just a process, a natural process of life. What we've done by adding in all the pollutants in our environment is put a burden on that system. We can measure those changes in the cells when they become significant enough that we can measure it. And we call those changes oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is the damage. It can occur from anything that impacts on the cell's detoxification system. If we ask a cell to work harder, its metabolism goes up, it creates more byproducts. So we can create oxidative stress with really intensive exercise, with chronic stress, with exposures to allergens, things that we're allergic to during allergy season if we have allergies. Anything that makes our body do a little bit more can create an oxidative stress. It's a fact of life. It's how we evolve and how we age. Now we put this pollution into the system, a lot of pollution, relentless pollution, putting an extra burden on those systems, and we see more oxidative stress. We see oxidative stress associated with the chemical exposures that we have in the indoor air, especially when people start to say, gee, there's something wrong with the air. I don't feel well in here. And the thing we call sick building syndrome. Some people feel it more than others. It's oxidative stress.
Yes, thank you. The next question is around the topic of the depletion of our natural resources. So, how do you think environmental degradation is going to be affecting the well-being of our population? What's your take?
You can start off with looking at how the summer's been here in Canada, um, how we managed to turn the air yellow in New York City based on forest fires. Um, it's not just the quality of air, but some people lost their homes. What kind of stress is that? I can't even imagine. Some people lost their lives. So that impacts on their surrounding family, etc. So there's all kinds of psychosocial impacts, air quality impacts, just based on global warming and climate change. There's the oceans are warming. The oceans are also rising. What's going to happen in the future to our grandchildren when in the cities that they live in on the coasts and they have to move inland? What kind of stress is that going to be? What about the amount of water that's going to be available? Is there going to be wars and world wars based on the fact that one country needs to attack another because they don't have enough water or they don't have enough food? Because we're also losing farmland, we're seeing droughts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the complexity of the environmental impacts that we are creating globally, but also socially, psychologically, physically, um, let alone the personal impact on what kind of disease are you going to get based on the environment.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, what is one environmental factor affecting human health the most that we need to be aware of in our day-to-day lives? Like, in other words, if there was one practical takeaway from this discussion, what would you say that it is and why?
If you watch hockey players being interviewed about anything, they will usually say, I worry only about what I can control, what I do on the ice. And it's a metaphor for the answer to this question. You can worry about global warming. You can try and have an influence on your member of parliament, but the bottom line is we all need to change. And so the most important thing to worry about with the hockey player mindset is worry about what you can control. Worry about your personal environment. Your personal environment is your indoor environment, most of which is in your house, and second of which is where you work. That's where 90% of your time is spent. And those are where your exposures are that you can reduce the exposures to. So it starts with product choice. What are you putting on your body? What are you putting in your body? What are you putting in the air that you breathe? Those are things that you can reduce your exposure to the most. Having a scent-free policy, for example, at work should be mandatory. It should be there to protect everybody to reduce exposures. Um, Having a good ventilation system as well, being able to take the air in your house and throw it outside and filter the air coming in, but control your personal exposures, control what you put into the air by the product choices that you make. That would be a place to start. Worry about what you can control. We actually know, by the way, that there has been legislation over the last 2 or 3 decades to try and reduce emissions from cars. And so we have less smog now than we did, say, 30 years ago. And one of the things that we have reduced outside is chemical pollutants. So now what we see is that the chemical pollutant levels didn't go down quite as much as we thought they would, because in a in a populous environment, say Toronto, which is population dense, urban environments, up to 80% of the chemicals outside contributing to outdoor air pollution are actually coming from the indoor environment, from things that we add to the air and the building materials. We are actually, when we ventilate our homes and buildings, we actually throw that stuff outside. It doesn't disappear either. It adds to the pollution outdoors. So if you want to do anything to decrease your exposures, the one thing you can control is what you're buying and using and throwing into the air. And everybody can help to make a little bit of a difference.
Yeah. So a lot of questions that we get from family, friends, and people that know someone that has this condition is, I want to ask you, Dr. Molot, how is MCS developed and how is it triggered?
In fact, we go back for a moment just to refresh anybody's memory. We talked about the um, the impact of the environment on living organisms, including us, and we talked about how foreign objects, foreign chemicals, etc., foreign substances get taken into the body, get taken into the cell, and have to be dealt with, and that um, when the system for detoxification is being overworked, damage is created that maybe can be corrected and healed, maybe not, through other molecules that can change the function of cells. And how it impacts on everybody depends on a lot of other factors like genetics and other things that could be impacting on that system. So the cell can detect chemicals, and it does so because it has sensors on the surface and inside that are called receptors that actually can sense chemicals. They're called chemosensitive receptors. Um, There's two in particular belong to this family, which I'm going to call TRP, because the name itself was way too long. And so there's TRPV1 and TRPA1. These are two receptors that are sitting on the surface of cells that are programmed from the last X millions of years to detect foreign chemicals and to signal the cell there's a chemical here and activate the cell to do something. And what happens with this oxidative stress that changes the cells is several things. One of which is the immune system says, what's going on over here? So it sends a message to the rest of the immune system. Something going on over here. And that messaging is called systemic inflammation. There's release of chemicals go around the body telling everybody, get ready, we may have to react to something here. So systemic inflammation and that oxidative stress together often work together. And both of those factors have an impact on those receptors that sense chemicals. And it tends to activate them. And in some people, it tends to sensitize them. What that means is the threshold to initiate a response in the first place is lowered. They're more sensitive than they used to be to pick things up. The cell, in response, makes more of these receptors. And there's something going on out here. Let's send more sensors out there to look for these guys. So we have more cells, more receptors on the cells with a lower threshold. And so the cell itself has become sensitized to respond. So what happens in MCS is that there will be a response depending on where those cells have become sensitized. The most common place they become sensitized is in the nervous system. And so our sensory systems that pick up chemicals and tell us something about it get turned on. So people with MCS, not only do they sense chemicals at a lower level than other people, they react adversely to them on a sensory level with pain, with changes in function in brain, such as cognition, fatigue. They also sense it quite common in the respiratory system because that's the first system that actually has contact with these chemical pollutants. And so we see respiratory complaints. And sometimes we we see people who have these respiratory complaints. We listen to the chest with the stethoscope. We take an X-ray. We do pulmonary function tests and say everything looks normal. But the people are saying, "But I feel short of breath. I feel chest tightness. I feel like I need to cough," because the sensors that tell us to do those things are reacting to things that they normally didn't react to and at much lower levels than before.
If you could please let us know, how do MCS symptoms vary in different affected individuals, and which groups are most vulnerable against this condition?
So pain is a variety of ways of presenting itself. It can present locally. You can get a headache. Well, what kind of headache you can get? A tension headache with pressure in your head, but also known to provoke migraine. 60 to 70% of people who have chronic migraine, frequent migraines, will tell you that there are scents in the air, like perfumes, et cetera, which will trigger migraine. So what we're looking at, generally speaking, is, oh, pain's really common. Um, Fatigue is really common. How do you describe that? Well, if it's more of a mental fatigue, you kind of get foggy in the head, maybe, or you get distracted and you can't work as effectively as before. Or it can be more of a physical fatigue where you just don't feel well and you feel more sluggish. So in people's individual descriptions will speak to the variation on how it presents, but it's that pattern, multiple system, especially brain and respiratory system, that we see over and over again. So it's meeting the criteria. Having said that, Um, most chronic conditions are comorbid. And what that means is when you have a chronic condition, you're more likely to have another one or get another one. So people start to accumulate them. So you can have asthma. We can diagnose that. We can do tests and go, oh, you have asthma. But the asthma could also be triggered off by levels of chemical pollutants that were previously tolerated. So do they meet the criteria for chemical sensitivity? Yeah, especially if they have other symptoms that are provoked, which they usually do. So it becomes complicated that chemical sensitivity, usually when you've had it for a while, is not sitting there in isolation anymore. So it becomes a clinical understanding that family docs especially have to deal with, which is comorbidity or multimorbidity of different conditions working together to make a bigger mess. Now, that's a problem. When you talk about or ask about which population, the most prevalent population to have MCS is middle-aged women. So, well, why? Well, middle age sort of speaks to the frequent exposures over a lifetime till eventually you start to see a breakdown. Um, but why women? Say, well, women obviously have more female hormones than men do. Hormones like estrogen have an impact on those TRPV1 and TRPA1 receptors. They sense it. So once they're sensitized, female hormones can play a role in there as well. Secondly, we were talking about the environment in the first episode, and we said, the environment is also um, your personal environment of who's in your environment and how you behave in there, and what you perceive from other people, and so on. So there's a social environment. Women use more chemical products in their bodies than men do. So women have increased exposure. Some of that is product choice, and the other is sort of this social phenomenon that still exists somewhat of unequal um, distribution of responsibilities in the home. Women tend to do more of the cleaning of the laundry. What are they exposed to? More chemical products, cleaning products, laundry products, fabric softeners, etc. Often scented as well. So women have more exposures. They have more of a hormonal impact on becoming sensitized. Generally speaking, women have a more sensitive sensory system. So, one of the things that we know is that women have a lower threshold when they start to feel pain. And one of the factors that impacts pain is these TRPV1 and TRPA1 receptors. So the threshold of those receptors just generally tends to be lower in females versus males. I don't know why. So women are more impacted at middle age than the rest of the population.
Mm-hmm. So, what types of challenges do individuals with MCS face while navigating public or personal spaces?
One of my favorite words is ubiquitous. It's a really cool word, ubiquitous. What does it mean? It means ever present. It's everywhere. And chemical pollutant exposures are ever present everywhere unless you go out far enough from an urban environment into the forest. They're just there. And they're most concentrated in the indoor environment. And so people with MCS face those exposures every day. So when we look at how do you treat MCS? And we don't know how to calm those receptors down. Just don't know how. So the next best thing is, well, you're going to manage this condition. And the thing that is the most effective is have a safe home. So we instruct people, get rid of all chemical pollutant exposures that you can. Some people can identify them easily that, oh, that smells make me sick, so they throw it out. Um, Others are not so easily identified if they just aren't perceiving a reaction, even though it's contributing to the continuous sensitization. So it actually was a study done recently where experts went into people's homes and looked around and told them where the chemical sources were coming from that they hadn't identified themselves, and asked them to clean those things out of the environment and then followed them. And what they found was two things. Number one, the level of those chemicals in the air went down compared to people who did not make those changes. And number two, the levels of oxidative stress that we can measure in research labs went down compared to those who did not make the changes. So there is a pilot study out now. Clean your home. But when you go out of the home, now you got a problem because, like the hockey player says, you don't have as much control over it as you can in your own home. So it's difficult to go to work. Some places have scent-free policies. According to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, people with MCS have a legal right to accommodation, and the most recommended accommodation is a scent-free policy. How well that can be managed, how well it's applied and enforced varies, but that's something that can be done in the workplace. Maybe it's good enough, maybe it's not. If you're working in a retail store, it's really hard to have a scent-free policy because people walk in and walk out all the time who don't have to follow that policy. So it's a problem for people once they go outdoors. Sometimes just going for a walk in the neighborhood when the laundry fabric softeners are being vented by the dryers can impact people. They can't even walk around their own neighborhood. But it causes a problem everywhere they go. Shopping, public transportation, people wear scented products. It's really, really common. And the scent industry will tell you that their sales are going up. They're doing a good job financially for their owners and for the people who have invested in them and so on, but they're continuing to impact the environment. So people have a hard place going any place. And so one of the major barriers for people is the healthcare system because you're going into an indoor environment that uses things like scented products, especially since COVID, deodorizers or not deodorizers, cleaners and detoxifiers are everywhere for people to apply to their hands and so on, many of which have an odor. But regardless of that, those environments have the use of scented products. Many hospitals have voluntarily tried to employ a scent-free policy. So I know here in Toronto, where I am, most of the hospitals in downtown Toronto have scent-free policies. And if you phone there just to make an appointment at some clinic, you'll hear the recorded message, please don't wear scents, we have a scent-free policy. How well that's police is debatable. So Ontario, for example, has over 100 hospitals that have scent-free policies. But then there's provinces like Quebec where there's one emergency department in the entire province. Why? I don't know. That's politics, but they don't have it. So there's a major impact on accessing healthcare for people with chemical sensitivities. It becomes even more of a problem in going to not just hospitals, but clinics. Do doctors' clinics, do laboratories have scent-free policies? Nope. Should they? Absolutely. Because they are denying access to healthcare to a significant segment of the population, which depending on how you measure it and you qualify it in surveys, but conservatively it's 3 to 6% of the population has MCS. You're less conservative, you can go up as high as 15%. But there are people who react to these scents, but there's no scent-free policy. So they can't access healthcare. And then there's the social impact. Well, I don't believe you. That doesn't make any sense. I never heard of that. I don't want to. And people are confronted with that every day, sometimes even in their own family. So people who have teenagers who are a difficult segment of the population sometimes to have to apply rules to, um, they don't want to have follow a scent-free policy. They don't want to tell their friends you can't come to my house because you're wearing a scented product. So they don't. And it creates a problem within family dynamics or going to weddings or any other kind of family celebration like Christmas. What kind of exposure you're going to have if your own family doesn't support you? So there's the general public, there's your personal public, there's your friends. Many people have losses. They have a loss of income if they can't work. They have litigation problems if they have to try and prove to workers' compensation or third party disability insurance companies that they deserve benefits because the consensus of opinion might be, well, we don't believe you. Why are you blaming the environment? And it's a big problem. So they have loss of income, they have loss of social support, they have loss of the quality of life. Maybe they have a loss of their own professional life. They have significant losses, and more likely to get other chronic conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome, like chronic pain disorders, like fibromyalgia or migraine headaches, etc. Um, so their health is majorly impacted by this, and nobody really is very supportive of it. Majority of people are not supportive and understanding of it. Their lives become very limited. Do these people suffer from loss? Absolutely. Are they angry? Many of them. This is not fair. Why do they have to have those exposures? Are they anxious and nervous about who's going to be ringing their doorbell or come to their house? They have anxiety, they have depression, and it's justifiable. It's not a psychiatric disorder. It's justifiable. It's justifiable for you to be anxious if someone's chasing you with a gun. That's not a psychiatric disorder.
Yeah. And what are the best ways to manage MCS symptoms?
The bottom line is if there were a lot less exposures in indoor environments, people with MCS would have a better quality of life until we learn how to turn this thing off. And we haven't learned how to do that yet. So it seems to me that it would be really great if the rest of the population was understandable and supportive and wanted to do something as well. Oh, that's a big ask. We can't even get people to agree whether global warming exists or not. But having said that, um, here in Ontario, the Ministry of Health had a task force for environmental health for 3 years to make recommendations to the government to try and be able to support people with MCS and comorbid conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, fibromyalgia. And one factor that was major was there's a lack of understanding, a lack of education, and then maybe education should be promoted. Unfortunately, the government in place right now has failed to respond to that task force for 5 years. And that's just criminal. But having said that, there are other um, places for sources of information that people with MCS can access and download to try and educate people around them to the reality of the condition. Canadian Human Rights Commission, it says right on their website, this is a legitimate biological condition with the right to accommodation in the workplace. So that says something. Then there's groups like the Canadian Environmental Health Association, the Environmental Health Association of Quebec, which is um, there before the Canadian group was. There's a tremendous amount of information available on their website with resources, with places you can go to download information and provide to the people around you, your family, your fellow employees, your superiors at work, anybody else you want to, and get the information out there that pollution is making people sick. It just happens to make you, if you have MCS, sick this way, and it's a legitimate condition. People should be more understanding. People will help blind people across the street. They will go out of their way for people that they know are disabled. But when your disability is invisible, you're ignored. And when you try and explain it, you're disbelieved because they can't see anything. You sound like a whiner or complainer. People need to be educated. And so each individual with MCS maybe can access some of this information and starts giving it to everybody because it comes from reliable sources.
Hmm. What are the preventative measures, if any, that can be taken to reduce the risk of developing chemical sensitivity?
The preventive measures should be um, kind of generic for everybody because we don't know who's going to get MCS. Just because you're not a female doesn't mean you can't get it, it just means less likely, right? We don't know who's going to get MCS and who's going to get nothing and who's going to end up with a neurodegenerative disorder as they get older. We don't know. We can't predict it. So your lifestyle should be a healthy one to try and prevent it. So there are two things that one can do. One is decrease the exposures. Goes back to that question you asked a while back about, well what can people do in general to offset the impact of pollution? Have less exposures, control what you can. So that's one part of the lifestyle. What kind of food do you eat? You know, is it saturated with dyes and chemicals for taste, or is it organic, which is the other end of the spectrum? What kind of foods do you eat? And it's not just what kind of foods you eat. What's in your diet? Because oxidative stress occurs when our detoxification system is less capable of managing exposures. And so, what does the detoxification system use to neutralize those exposures and manage them? Antioxidants. Where do you get antioxidants? Well, we make some biologically, so nutritional support for that would be important. But we also get a lot of them in our diet. Where do we get them? Fruits and vegetables, foods that are colored. One of the things is I eat the rainbow, but colored foods, vegetables and fruit, loaded with antioxidants. And we should be eating more than the Canadian Food Guide recommends because they do not consider chronic chemical pollution or environmental pollution exposures. We should eat, if you can, 8 to 10 helpings a day, but eat as many as you can all the time. That should be your snack. That should be your go-to. Your plate should be piled with salad rather than piled with meat and potatoes. It's not wrong with meat and potatoes, but where'd the meat come from? Where'd the potatoes come from? Decrease your exposures and really increase the nutrients required to try and help your detoxification systems. So one of the ways that one of the difficulties we have with detoxification is sometimes we can't break things down very well. So what does the body do with them? You can't break them down. How do you get rid of them? Well, if they're water soluble, we can pee them out. But if they're not water soluble, and majority aren't to begin with, then we can't. We got to dump them somewhere. We dissolve them in fats and oils. The more fat you have, the more chemical pollutants you're going to store in your body. So try and maintain a good weight. Um, One way you can get rid of some of those things in there is to sweat. What's the best way to sweat? Aerobic exercise. Get out there and run. You don't have to. You don't have to be a triple triathlete to be a good detoxifier. You just need to do some kind of exercise which is aerobic to make you increase your circulation and sweat, and you'll get rid of things. Put less in, try and get things out. Even a dry sauna can help the sweat, but you need to do all of these things to support the system. So, having a healthy lifestyle, having a healthy diet, not putting chemicals in your body from whatever source, air, food, water, all of these things make a difference to everybody. And in particular, if you're the one who's going to get MCS, it helps to prevent MCS as well.
Thank you. So, the last question: how can understanding and accommodating MCS, for example, choosing healthier products or implementing scent free policies, benefit the broader population?
We tend to live in a pretty good country. Um, and we have rules and laws to make sure that life is better for people that are disabled. I mean, a great example of people in a wheelchair. Buildings have ramps. Elevator buttons are lower now so that they can reach it. Doors are wide enough that the wheelchair can get in. And new rules for restaurants, for example, is that the washroom is on the main floor so that people don't have to take their wheelchair downstairs because that just doesn't work. So it's making life better for people with disabilities that we understand and recognize. And we as a society want to be like that. We want to be fair to everybody else less fortunate than us. If Sentry policies and a great effort to reduce chemical pollutant exposures, better building materials in buildings going forward so they don't contaminate, less chemicals in furnishings, stain repellents, et cetera, that are in furniture and in their clothing and so on, that are off-gassing, that are inside most human beings, adding to the burden. If we had a general understanding, starting with indoor air quality, scent-free policies, let's stop wearing this stuff. You want to use it? You want to smoke cigarettes? Go ahead. But you can't smoke it within 9 feet of that doorway, and you certainly can't smoke it inside or in my house. You want to do it? Go ahead. You have that freedom. You want to wear scented products? Go ahead. But you do not have a legal right anywhere to pollute my air or the person with chemical sensitivities air either. That right does not exist. And so if we all got on the same bandwagon of we need to reduce our exposures, not only would the MCS people have a better life, but maybe so would everybody else, because the impact of the indoor air with respect to its impact on developing chronic disease, partially based on the outdoor air coming in, being mixed with indoor chemicals, then everybody's going to be better off. We see neurodevelopmental disorders going up. That's not genetic. Why is it going up? If it's not genetic, it's environmental. And one of the things that we have been able to see is that these exposures, pollutant exposures, increase the incidence and prevalence of autistic disorder, as an example, of ADHD, as another example. Why are these things going up? Because babies are being born with as many chemicals in them as their mothers, with a less mature detoxification system. Gee, why are their brains affected? So everybody, the entire population, future populations, would be better off if we decrease these exposures starting yesterday.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Footprints and Impacts. If you found value in today's conversation, be sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with friends, family, and especially someone who might benefit. Don't forget to follow our upcoming episodes for more insights on sustainability, health, inclusion, and how we can all make a positive environmental impact. Until next time, stay curious, take care of yourself, and be well.
This podcast is part of the Empowering Community and Removal of Barriers project, funded in part by the Government of Canada's Social Development Partnerships Program, Disability Component.